The evening air had grown chilly as Officer James Reeves drove slowly through Millfield Park. His shift was almost over, just 30 more minutes of patrol before he could head home to a microwave dinner and whatever game was on TV that night. The park had officially closed at sundown about an hour ago, but teenagers often snuck in after hours. Most nights, he'd just flash his lights and they'd scatter like birds. Tonight was different. As his cruiser's headlights swept across the central playground area, they caught a solitary figure sitting perfectly still on a bench near the walking path. Not teenagers, just one man. "Dispatch, this is Unit 437. I'm checking on someone at Millfield Park," James spoke into his radio. "Copy that, 437, came the crackly reply. James parked his patrol car and stepped out, adjusting his belt and touching his flashlight out of habit. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't even turned to look at the police car with its lights still on. That was unusual. Most people at least react when a cop shows up. As he got closer, James could make out more details. The man looked to be in his mid-40s with a scruffy beard and hair that needed a cut. His clothes were worn but clean, faded jeans, a thick canvas jacket with frayed cuffs, and heavy boots. Next to him on the bench sat a large military-style backpack, the kind with lots of pockets and straps. "Evening, sir," James called out when he was about 20 feet away. No response. The man just stared straight ahead at the empty swing set, his eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. His hands rested on his knees, and James noticed they were weathered, with calluses and old scars. James approached carefully. 15 years on the force had taught him to be cautious. The man could be drunk, high, mentally ill, or just lost in thought. But something about his posture, ramrod straight despite his apparent exhaustion, made James think differently. "Sir, I need to let you know that the park closed at sundown," James said, stopping a respectful distance away. Nothing, not even a blink. James moved into the man's line of sight and tried again, a bit louder this time. "Sir, can you hear me? The park is closed." Finally, the man's eyes slowly focused, like someone waking from a deep dream. He looked at James without surprise or concern, just a flat, empty gaze that somehow seemed to look through him. "I need to see some ID, please," James said, maintaining a professional tone. The man blinked slowly. "What time is it?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "It's just after 9 p.m. The park closed at 8. "Are you all right, sir?" The man nodded slightly, then reached for his backpack. James tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. But the man just straightened his back even more, if that was possible, and looked up at the night sky. "Stars are clear tonight," he said softly. "Reminds me of nights in the desert. You could see every star in the universe out there. No light pollution." James relaxed slightly but remained alert. Something about this situation felt different from the usual park stragglers. The man wasn't acting threatening, just disconnected. "I still need to see some ID, sir, and I need to know what you're doing here after hours." The man finally turned to look directly at James. His eyes were deep-set and tired, with dark circles underneath that spoke of sleepless nights. "Just sitting," he said simply. "Just needed some quiet." James noticed the man's hands were now trembling slightly. Not the shake of someone drunk or high, but something else, something he'd seen before in his older brother when he came back from overseas. "Sir, do you have somewhere to go tonight?" James asked, his tone softening slightly. The man's eyes drifted back to the empty playground. "I'm supposed to be watching," he muttered. "Can't leave the position." "They're counting on me." It was then that James spotted something he'd missed before, the edge of what looked like a military dog-tag chain around the man's neck, mostly hidden under his jacket. And when the man shifted slightly, James noticed the unusual stiffness in one of his legs. The picture was starting to come together, but James still had a job to do. Rules were rules, and the park was closed no matter who this man was. "Sir, I'm going to need you to pack up your things." "I can't let you stay here tonight," James said firmly but not unkindly. The man's eyes snapped back to focus, suddenly alert. His hand tightened on the backpack strap. "I can't abandon my post," he said, his voice taking on an edge of panic. "Not again. Not like last time." Officer James took a small step back, giving the man some space. Years of police work had taught him when to push and when to ease off. Right now, the stranger's white-knuckle grip on his backpack and the wild look in his eyes said to tread carefully. "Look, buddy," James said, softening his tone. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I can't just leave you out here all night either." The man's eyes darted around the empty park, scanning the tree line and the shadows between playground equipment. His breathing had quickened. "There's movement in Sector 4, he muttered, no longer speaking to James but to someone who wasn't there. James had seen this before. His cousin Tom had come back from overseas different, jumpy at loud noises, convinced he was still in danger sometimes. The department had recently started training officers to recognize signs of combat stress, but reading about it in a manual was different from seeing it play out in real time. "Sir," James tried again, keeping his voice steady and calm. "My name is Officer Reeves, James Reeves. Can you tell me your name?" The man's focus snapped back to James, studying his uniform with sudden intensity. "You're not in my unit," he said flatly. "No, sir, I'm not. I'm with the Millfield Police Department. We're in Millfield Park in Ohio. It's Tuesday, October 12th. James remembered the training. Help ground them in the here and now. The man blinked hard several times, his left hand moving to rub at his temple. For a moment, there was a flicker of something different in his eyes, confusion, then a flash of embarrassment. "Michael," he said finally. "My name's Michael Sanderson." James nodded, offering a small smile. "Good to meet you, Michael. Now, can you tell me why you're out here so late?" Michael's shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid military posture giving way to exhaustion. Just needed somewhere quiet. "The shelter's too noisy. Too many people." "Shelter?" James asked. "You staying at the First Street Mission?" A short nod was Michael's only response. His eyes drifted back to the empty playground. James shifted his weight, unsure how to proceed. Technically, he should be issuing a citation for being in the park after hours. But something told him that adding to this man's problems wouldn't help anyone. "Listen, Michael, I still need to see some ID if you have it." This request seemed to trigger something. Michael sat up straight again, his expression hardening. "You detaining me, officer?" James kept his face neutral. "Just doing my job, sir. Standard procedure." Michael reached slowly into his jacket, movements deliberate and careful. He pulled out a worn wallet and from it extracted not a driver's license, but a military ID card. He held it out, his hand once again shaking slightly. James took it and shined his flashlight on the ID. Michael Sanderson, U.S. Army E7. The photo showed a different man, younger, clean-shaven, with clear eyes and a confident expression. The issue date was 12 years ago. "You're a sergeant," James said, handing the ID back. Michael corrected flatly, was a lot of things. James noticed Michael's right leg was stretched out stiffly in front of him. Following his gaze, Michael grimaced. "Souvenir from Kandahar," he said, tapping his knee with a hollow sound that wasn't quite right. 16 inches of titanium and plastic. "Doctors said I was lucky." He didn't sound like he felt lucky. James shifted tactics. "How long have you been back stateside, Sergeant?" 4 years, 2 months, 17 days, Michael answered without hesitation. Not that I'm counting. A cool breeze rustled the trees around them, and Michael zipped his jacket higher. His backpack remained clutched close, one strap wrapped around his arm as if he feared someone might snatch it. "What's in the pack that's so important?" James asked, keeping his tone conversational. Michael's expression darkened. "Everything," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "All I've got left." James nodded, understanding more than Michael might have realized. He'd seen plenty of people who'd lost everything, to addiction, to mental illness, to just plain bad luck. This man had lost something different, something harder to explain. "I've still got a problem here, Michael," James said finally. "I can't let you stay in the park overnight." "Then do what you gotta do," Michael replied, his voice taking on that 1,000-yard stare quality again. "Write your ticket. Take me in. Whatever procedure says." But as James looked at the military ID still in his hand, at the dates of service that spanned multiple combat tours, he knew this wasn't going to be a routine call after all. James clipped his flashlight back onto his belt and sat down on the bench, leaving about 3 feet between himself and Michael. He wasn't following protocol anymore, but sometimes being human mattered more than being a cop by the book. "I had a buddy in the National Guard," James said, looking out at the same empty playground Michael had been staring at. Did 2 tours in Iraq. Came back different. Michael said nothing, but James noticed his grip on the backpack loosened slightly. He used to do this too, James continued. Find quiet places away from people. Said his brain needed the space to sort things out. The radio on James's shoulder crackled. Unit 437, what's your status at Millfield Park? James pressed the talk button. All clear, dispatch. Just doing a routine check. Should be wrapping up soon. Copy that, 437. A few crickets chirped in the grass nearby. The night had grown cooler, and James could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. You got family around here, Michael? He asked. Michael's jaw tightened. Had a wife. Lisa, she stuck it out through 3 deployments. Couldn't handle what came home the last time. He gestured vaguely at himself. Can't say I blame her. Kids? Michael shook his head. We were waiting. Wanted to be settled first. A bitter laugh escaped him. Guess that was smart at least. James nodded, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Sometimes people just needed space to talk at their own pace. What's in the backpack? He asked finally, keeping his tone casual. Michael hesitated, then unzipped the top of the pack just enough to reach inside. James tensed slightly out of habit, but relaxed when Michael pulled out a small, worn photo album. Tommy and Dave, Michael said, opening to a page that showed 3 soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning in front of a dusty vehicle. We were together since basic, called ourselves the 3 Musketeers. James didn't ask where the other 2 were now. The answer was written in the lines around Michael's eyes. Today's the anniversary, Michael said, answering the unasked question. 4 years ago today, we were on patrol. Standard route we'd done a dozen times. He closed the album carefully. I was point man. Should have spotted it. The IED, James said quietly. Michael nodded, staring down at his prosthetic leg. I got lucky. Blast threw me clear. Tommy and Dave were right behind me. James let that sit for a moment. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow. That why you're out here instead of at the shelter? He asked finally. Can't sleep on days like this, and the shelter, Michael grimaced. Guy in the next bunk snores like a chainsaw. Another one talks in his sleep. Walls are thin. 27 men in one room. Sounds rough. Better than some places I've slept. Michael managed a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. At least there's a roof. James looked at his watch. Nearly 9:30 p.m. His shift was officially over, but paperwork would keep him at the station until at least 10:30. He made a decision. Listen, Michael, I can't let you stay here overnight. Park rules. But he hesitated, knowing he was crossing a professional line. You hungry? The question seemed to catch Michael off guard. What? Food. You know, that stuff people eat. I was gonna grab something after my shift. Lou's diner stays open till midnight. Michael looked at him suspiciously. This some kind of trick to get me to the station. James shook his head. No tricks. Just food. And maybe a chance to properly honor your friend's memory somewhere warmer than a park bench. For the first time, Michael's expression softened slightly. He carefully put the photo album back in his backpack and zipped it closed. Why would you do that? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. James stood up slowly. Because someone did it for my buddy when he needed it. Call it paying it forward. Michael hesitated, then used the bench armrest to push himself up. James noticed how he favored his right leg, the prosthetic one, putting his weight on the left as he stood. I'm not looking for charity, Michael said stiffly. Good, because I'm not offering any, James replied. Just a meal and some company. Unless you've got better plans for tonight. Michael looked around the empty park, then back at James. Something in his expression had changed. A tiny spark of something that might have been hope, or at least a pause in the despair. Your car or mine? Michael asked, the faintest trace of humor in his voice as he nodded toward the police cruiser. James smiled. I think mine's got better heaving. As they walked toward the car, James noticed Michael limping more heavily than before. Sitting in the cold probably hadn't done his leg any favors. You good to walk? He asked. Michael's face hardened with pride. I've marched 20 miles with a full pack. I can make it to your car. James nodded, respecting the man's dignity enough not to offer help that wasn't wanted. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought against enemies, but against the perception of weakness. Lou's Diner sat on the corner of Main and Elm, its neon sign buzzing and flickering every few seconds. The place was nearly empty at this hour, just a couple of truck drivers hunched over coffee at the counter and an older woman reading a paperback in a booth by the window. The bell jingled as James held the door open. Michael hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, his eyes quickly scanning the room, noting exits and the positions of everyone present. Old habits. James, called a plump woman with gray hair tied back in a bun. Bit late for you, isn't it? Hey, Dottie, James replied with a smile. Got caught up with work. This is Michael. Dottie's warm smile didn't falter, but her eyes took in Michael's worn clothes and unshaven face with a quick glance. Any friend of James is welcome here, she said, grabbing 2 menus. Booth or counter? Booth, James said, catching Michael's slight nod of approval. A booth would put his back to a wall, not exposed. They settled into a booth near the back. Michael set his backpack beside him, one hand remaining protectively on it. The vinyl seats squeaked as they sat down. Coffee? Dottie asked, already pouring 2 cups without waiting for an answer. Thanks, Dottie, James said, and whatever pie you've got left. Apple and cherry today. Made the cherry myself this morning. Cherry for me then, James decided. Michael? Michael looked uncomfortable with the attention. Just coffee's fine. James shook his head. Man cannot live on coffee alone. 2 slices of cherry, Dottie, and a couple of those breakfast specials. Coming right up, Dottie said, heading back to the kitchen. Michael wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, soaking in the warmth. His eyes kept moving to the door, to the other customers, to the windows. Always alert. You come here a lot? He asked James, finally taking a sip of his coffee. Couple times a week. Dottie's known me since I was a kid stealing penny candy from the general store her parents used to run. That got the smallest hint of a smile from Michael. You? Breaking the law? Hard to picture. I was young and stupid, James laughed. Got caught too. Her dad made me stock shelves for a month to pay it off. The food arrived quickly, plates piled with eggs, hash browns, bacon, and toast. Michael stared at his plate for a long moment. Something wrong? James asked. Michael shook his head slowly. Been a while since I had a hot meal that didn't come from a shelter-serving line. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. James noticed how Michael ate methodically, taking small bites, chewing thoroughly, the way someone eats when they've learned not to waste anything. You mentioned the First Street mission, James said between bites. How long you been staying there? 3 months, Michael replied. Before that, St. Anthony's in Columbus. Before that, he shrugged. Around. Any work? A shadow passed over Michael's face. Tried construction. Leg couldn't handle it. Tried office work. Brain couldn't handle it. He stabbed at his eggs. Hard to focus some days. Harder to explain to bosses why I dive under desks when doors slam. James nodded, understanding. My cousin tried 4 jobs his first year back. 5th one finally stuck. Auto mechanic. Says working with his hands helps keep him grounded. Michael's eyes flickered with interest. I used to be good with engines. Was a mechanic in my unit when they needed extra hands. There's a shop on Western Avenue. Owner's an old Vietnam vet. Might be worth talking to him. Maybe, Michael said, but James could hear the doubt in his voice. Halfway through the meal, the bell over the door jingled, and 2 young men walked in, laughing loudly. One of them slapped the other on the back, creating a sharp, cracking sound. Michael's reaction was instant. His fork clattered to the plate, and his body tensed, eyes going wide. His breathing quickened, and his hand moved instinctively to his side, where a weapon might have been. James kept his voice calm and steady. You're at Lou's Diner, Michael, in Millfield. It's just some kids coming in for food. Everything's fine. Michael blinked rapidly, forcing himself back to the present. Sweat had broken out on his forehead. Sorry, he muttered, clearly embarrassed. Happens sometimes. No need to apologize, James said, deliberately continuing to eat as if nothing unusual had happened. Normalcy sometimes helped more than drawing attention. Michael picked up his fork again, but his appetite seemed diminished. He took a few more mechanical bites before pushing the plate away. "Tell me about Tommy and Dave," James said quietly. Michael looked up, surprised. "What? You said today's their anniversary. Seems like they should be remembered." Michael was silent for so long that James thought he might have pushed too far. Then, slowly, Michael reached for his backpack and unzipped a side pocket. He pulled out a small, tarnished metal object and placed it on the table between them. It was a silver star medal. "They gave me this," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said I saved 4 men that day. Pulled them from the burning vehicle after the blast." His finger traced the outline of the star. "Never felt right wearing it. Not when Tommy and Dave didn't come home at all." James looked at the medal, understanding the weight it carried, not just the weight of honor, but of survivor's guilt. "Sounds like they'd be proud of you," James said. Michael's eyes glistened. Tommy had a little girl. She was 3 when he deployed. He carried her picture everywhere. He took a deep breath. Dave was going to propose to his girlfriend when we got back. Had the ring in his footlocker. As Michael spoke, something changed in his face. The distant look faded, replaced by something more present, more connected. As if speaking their names, sharing their stories, somehow brought them, and him, back to life. The diner had emptied out, leaving just James, Michael, and Dottie, who was wiping down the counter and occasionally glancing their way. The wall clock read 11:15 p.m. Outside, a light rain had started, drops tapping against the windows. "More coffee?" Dottie called over. James nodded, and she brought the pot over, refilling both their mugs. "You boys doing all right?" she asked, her eyes lingering on Michael with grandmotherly concern. "We're good, thanks," James answered. When she'd gone back to the counter, Michael carefully picked up the silver star and returned it to his backpack. His hands seemed steadier now. "You know what I miss most?" he said suddenly. "Besides the obvious." He gestured vaguely toward where Tommy and Dave would have been. "The sense of purpose. Waking up every day knowing exactly what needed to be done and why it mattered." James nodded. "My cousin says the same thing. Says civilian life feels fuzzy around the edges sometimes." "Fuzzy," Michael repeated, considering the word. "Yeah, that fits. Like everything's out of focus. Can't tell what's important anymore." He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. In the army, everything was clear. Protect your unit. Complete the mission. Watch your buddies back. "And now?" James asked. Michael's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "Now I try to make it through each day. Find a place to sleep. Stand in line for meals. Avoid thinking too much." He shrugged. "Not much of a mission statement." James reached for his wallet. "Let me get this." "I can pay my share," Michael said, his pride flaring up. "I know you can," James replied easily. "But I invited you, so this one's on me. Next time can be your treat." The suggestion of a next time hung in the air between them. Michael didn't acknowledge it directly, but something in his expression softened. As James paid at the counter, he had a quick, quiet conversation with Dottie. She nodded several times, looking over at Michael. "Ready?" James asked, returning to the table. Outside, the rain had picked up. James handed Michael a small umbrella from his car. "Here, take this." "I've got another one." "Where we going?" Michael asked, looking uncertain. "I called in a favor," James explained. "Dottie's nephew Pete runs the Millfield Motel down the street. He's got a room you can use tonight. Clean, quiet, private bathroom. Beats the shelter." Michael's expression closed off immediately. "I told you I don't want charity." "It's not charity," James said firmly. "Pete hires me for security at events a few times a year. He owes me. The room would be empty anyway." Michael looked unconvinced. "Why are you doing this?" James considered the question carefully. "Because 40 years ago, you saved 4 men when you could have saved yourself first. Because you got that medal for a reason, whether you want to wear it or not." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because I've seen too many guys like you fall through the cracks. Guys who gave everything for their country and got left with nowhere to go." Rain pattered on the sidewalk around them. A car drove by, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Michael stood silently, conflict evident in his face. Finally, he asked, "Just for tonight?" "Just for tonight," James confirmed. "Tomorrow's a new day." We'll figure it out then. The Millfield Motel was a simple one-story building with a dozen rooms. Pete, a heavy-set man with a bushy mustache, was waiting at the front desk despite the late hour. He handed over a key without comment, just a respectful nod to Michael. Room 8 was basic but clean. A double bed with fresh sheets, a small bathroom, a TV, and a mini fridge. For Michael, after months in crowded shelters, it might as well have been a palace. "There's a coffee maker," James pointed out, "and Pete put some sandwiches in the fridge for morning." Michael set his backpack carefully on the bed, looking around the room as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. "I'll be back tomorrow around 9, James said, heading for the door. "Get some rest." "James," Michael called, stopping him. He seemed to struggle with what to say next. "Thank you," he managed finally. Simple words, but James could hear everything behind them. "Try to get some sleep," James replied. "That's an order, Sergeant." The ghost of a smile touched Michael's lips. "Yes, sir." As James drove home through the rain, he found himself thinking about what he'd do tomorrow. He wasn't scheduled to work, which meant he could spend some time helping Michael. There was that VA outreach officer he knew, and his cousin might have some leads on veteran-friendly employers. And Pete's brother-in-law ran a halfway house specifically for vets getting back on their feet. He realized he was making plans, mapping out a mission. Maybe that's what Michael needed most, someone to help him find that sense of purpose again, that clarity. Maybe purpose didn't have to come from a uniform or a battlefield. Maybe sometimes it could come from a chance encounter on a park bench, from one human recognizing something in another. James pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat listening to the rain on the roof of his car. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered during his shift, something that went beyond tickets and regulations and protocols. Tomorrow would be a beginning, not just for Michael, but maybe for him too. Morning came with clear skies and sunshine that poured through the thin motel curtains. Michael woke with a start, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. No snoring from neighboring bunks, no early risers shuffling around, no shelter volunteers calling out breakfast time. Just quiet. He sat up, rubbing his face. He'd slept better than he had in months, though that wasn't saying much. The digital clock on the nightstand read 8:17 a.m. Michael swung his legs over the side of the bed, grimacing as he fitted his prosthetic into place. Morning routine, something that used to take 5 minutes in his army days, now took 15, each movement a reminder of what he'd lost. After a hot shower, another luxury compared to the rushed, lukewarm ones at the shelter, Michael found himself standing in front of the small bathroom mirror. A stranger stared back at him, bearded and hollow-eyed. On impulse, he opened his backpack and dug out a small travel kit. The razor inside was old but serviceable. By the time a knock came at the door at 9:05, Michael had shaved and combed his hair. He hadn't looked this put together in weeks. James stood outside with 2 coffee cups and a paper bag. "Brought breakfast," he said, then paused, noticing the change. "You look different." Michael shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Found my razor." "Suits you," James said simply, handing him one of the coffees. "Hope you like donuts. Baker's special today." They sat at the small table by the window, eating in companionable silence. The donuts were still warm, covered in cinnamon sugar that left their fingers sticky. "Sleep okay?" James asked eventually. "Better than usual," Michael admitted. He hesitated, then added, "Thanks. For this." He gestured vaguely at the room, the food, everything. James nodded, accepting the thanks without making Michael repeat it. "I made some calls this morning," he said. "Got 3 people I think you should meet." Michael tensed slightly. "What kind of people?" "First is Bobby Chen. Runs the Veterans Resource Center downtown. He's a Gulf War vet himself. Knows how to cut through VA red tape better than anyone in the state." Michael's expression was guarded. "I've dealt with the VA before. Lots of forms, not much help." "Bobby's different," James insisted. "He's helped dozens of guys get their benefits straightened out, find housing, medical care. Even got my cousin into a PTSD program that actually worked." Michael looked down at his coffee. "I'm not good with crowds. Those places are always packed." He agreed to meet us before they officially open, just the 3 of us. The consideration in this simple accommodation wasn't lost on Michael. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Second person, he asked. Frank Wilson. Owns that auto shop I mentioned. Looking for someone with mechanical experience who can handle the afternoon shift. James took another bite of his donut. No pressure, just a conversation. And the third? Doc Sullivan. Runs a support group for combat vets. Small group, meets twice a week in the back room of his physical therapy office. James leaned forward. They're good people, Michael. Real talk, no BS, no civilians asking if you ever shot anybody. A flicker of interest crossed Michael's face, quickly replaced by skepticism. And all these people just happen to have openings. Just like that. Not just like that, James corrected. I've known these guys for years. Bobby helped my cousin. I fixed a parking ticket for Frank once. And Doc's kid and mine play baseball together. He shrugged. Small town. Connections matter. Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. The familiar weight of hopelessness was battling something new, a dangerous feeling he'd almost forgotten. Possibility. Why me? He asked without turning around. You find a homeless vet in the park, and suddenly you're rebuilding his whole life. There's got to be dozens of guys at that shelter who need help. James considered the question carefully. Maybe it's because of the date, you being at that park on the anniversary. Maybe it's because of Tommy and Dave. He paused. Or maybe it's because when I saw that silver star, I remembered why I became a cop in the first place. To help people who need it. He joined Michael at the window. Either way, here we are. I'm offering to make some introductions, that's all. What happens after that is up to you. Michael turned to face him. And if none of it works out, if I'm back at the shelter next week, then at least we tried, James said simply. Better than not trying at all, right? The question hung in the air between them. Finally, Michael nodded. Okay, let's start with this Bobby guy. The Veterans Resource Center was housed in an old brick building downtown. True to his word, James had arranged for them to arrive before opening hours. Bobby Chen, a compact man with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes, met them at the door. James, he greeted with a firm handshake, then turned to Michael. And you must be Sergeant Sanderson. He offered his hand. Staff Sergeant Bobby Chen, Army, retired. Something in his bearing, in the way he stood and spoke, immediately told Michael this wasn't some civilian playing at understanding. This was one of his own. Michael's fine, he replied, taking the offered hand. Come on in, Bobby said, leading them through a reception area to a small office in the back. Coffee's fresh. Not as good as Army coffee, but that's probably a good thing. For the first time in months, Michael found himself smiling, really smiling. Nothing's as bad as Army coffee, he agreed. As they sat down, Michael caught sight of a photograph on Bobby's desk, a much younger Bobby in desert camo, arm in arm with his unit. The familiar image unlocked something in Michael's chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was a place he could belong. 1 month later, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Wilson's auto shop, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Michael wiped his hands on a rag, leaving streaks of grease as he stepped back to examine his work. The engine of the old Ford pickup gleamed, parts replaced, connections tightened, ready to run better than it had in years. Looks good, came a voice from behind him. Frank Wilson, a barrel-chested man with thinning gray hair, peered over Michael's shoulder. Mrs. Jenkins is gonna be happy. That truck was her husband's pride and joy before he passed. Michael nodded, a sense of satisfaction warming his chest. Just needed some careful attention. Good bones underneath all that rust. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Like someone else I know. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It's nearly 5. Why don't you close up? I've got to run to the parts store before they close. I can stay late if you need, Michael offered. Got nowhere to be. Nope, Frank shook his head firmly. You've got that thing at the community center. Doc Sullivan mentioned it yesterday. Michael had almost forgotten. The Veterans Outreach Program. James had texted him about it earlier. Right, he said, already reaching for his jacket hanging on a nearby hook. Thanks for reminding me. As Frank left, Michael took a final look around the shop. 1 month ago, he couldn't have imagined this. A steady job doing work he was good at, a small apartment he could actually afford with Bobby's help navigating his veterans' benefits, and a routine that kept the worst of his nightmares at bay. Outside, the streets of Millfield were bathed in golden late afternoon light. Michael walked with purpose, his gait still uneven but stronger now. Regular meals and the physical work at the garage had put some meat back on his frame. The constant exercise had even made the prosthetic feel more like a part of him again. He passed the park where it had all started, where James had found him that night, lost in his memories and grief. Michael paused, looking at the bench where he'd been sitting. It seemed smaller somehow, less significant. Just a bench now, not a lifeline in a storm of emotions. The community center was a renovated school building at the edge of downtown. Michael arrived early, as was his habit now. Being punctual was something the army had drilled into him, a small piece of his old self he reclaimed. James was already there, talking with Bobby Chen in the lobby. Both men smiled when they saw him. "Just the man we were waiting for," James said, extending his hand. Michael shook it firmly. Their weekly coffee meetups had become a fixture in his new life, but he hadn't expected to see James here today. "What's going on?" Michael asked, noting the unusual energy between the two men. Bobby grinned. "Remember that idea we talked about? The Veterans Outreach Partnership with the police department?" Michael nodded. It had been a passing comment during one of Doc Sullivan's group sessions, how many confrontations between police and veterans might be avoided if officers had better training about PTSD and combat stress. "Well," James continued, "the chief approved it as a pilot program. We're looking for someone to help coordinate it, someone who understands both sides." Michael looked between them, realization dawning slowly. "You want me to do it?" "Part-time to start," Bobby explained. "You keep your job at Frank's shop, but 2 days a week, you'd work with us. Share your experiences, help train officers, be a bridge between the department and veterans in crisis." "We need someone who's been there," James added quietly. "Someone who can speak the truth about what it's like to come home changed." Michael's first instinct was to say no. Public speaking had never been his thing, and the idea of sharing his struggles with strangers made him uneasy. But then he thought about that night in the park, how close he'd come to being just another statistic. Another homeless vet arrested for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Take all the time you need," Bobby assured him. They moved into the main hall where chairs had been set up in rows. The room was filling up with a mix of people, veterans in various stages of civilian reintegration, police officers, social workers, and ordinary citizens. As Michael took his seat, he spotted a familiar face in the back row, Dottie from Lou's Diner, who now saved him a slice of cherry pie whenever he stopped in. Next to her sat Pate from the motel, who'd helped him find his apartment. Small connections that had grown into a network of support. The speaker that evening was a specialist in trauma recovery. Michael listened attentively, recognizing his own experiences in many of the examples she gave. At one point, she mentioned how isolation often reinforces trauma, while community can be the most powerful healing force. As the presentation ended and people began to mingle, James appeared at Michael's side with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing one over. Michael accepted it gratefully. "Thanks." After a pause, he added, "For everything, not just the coffee." James shrugged, embarrassed by the sentiment. "Just doing my job." "No," Michael said firmly. "What you did went way beyond your job." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the room full of people making connections, sharing stories, building bridges between different worlds. "I think I'll do it," Michael said finally. "The outreach program." James nodded, unsurprised. "I figured you might." "I'm not fixed," Michael felt compelled to add. "I still have bad days. Nightmares. Times when crowds are too much." "Nobody's asking you to be fixed," James replied. "Just to be who you are. Someone who's walked through fire and came out the other side." Michael thought about Tommy and Dave, about the silver star in his backpack that he still couldn't bring himself to display. Maybe this was how he could honor them, by helping others find their way back, by being the guide he needed when he first came home. "There's a remembrance ceremony next week," Michael said, "for fallen soldiers. I was thinking of going." "Want company?" James offered. Michael considered it, then nodded. "Yeah, I think Tommy and Dave would approve." As they walked out into the evening, Michael realized something had changed in him. The weight of survival guilt hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted somehow, become bearable. For the first time in years, he was looking forward rather than back, carrying his past but not trapped by it. One chance encounter, one person who saw beyond the surface, had changed everything. And now, perhaps, he could do the same for someone else.